So the events in Ukraine began in November of 2013. I got there in March. Yanukovych left at the end of February 2014. I got there a few weeks after that for the first piece I wrote for the LRB. And I talked to a lot of people in Kiev, at Maidan, and then I went to Odessa, which at the time was kind of poised in between the Ukrainian and the pro-Russian camps. The overwhelming impression that I had in March was that you had this incredible uprising of people who had really for 20 odd years had a really tough time of it. Ukraine was not a successful post-Soviet state. It was one of the countries in the post-Soviet space that seemed like it was going to benefit the most from independence in 1991. It had an educated workforce. It was highly industrialized. It was close to Europe. For all those reasons, I think there was a lot of optimism in Ukraine and possibly in the West also. But particularly in Ukraine, I think a lot of people felt like they had a pretty good chance to prosper, and that didn't happen. Ukraine's one of the poorest and least successful of the post-Soviet states, especially in comparison to where it was in 1991. The country's industrial capacity collapsed. Tons of weapons disappeared through the ports. Ukraine was this place that a lot of the goods, a lot of the contraband left the Soviet space in the 90s. So, in short, it was not prospering. It was not doing well. It had an incredibly corrupt political elite. And in 2004, people came out to the streets to protest a rigged election. That was the Orange Revolution. They got their candidate. That administration was not a success, but it had some successes. And so it looked like 2013 Maidan and was a kind of continuation of this and a kind of completion of it. So in March, to be there and to see how, to talk to people whose friends had died on Maidan, and who had been out in the streets in very cold weather, who were being shot at, and finally they sort of achieved their goal of chasing Yanukovych from power. It was incredibly exciting, inspiring. It was the sort of thing that people said could not happen in the post-Soviet space. It could not happen in a place like Ukraine, which was so cynical, which was so corrupt, where people had really given up hope that they could be represented in the political space. So on the one hand, you had this inspiring revolution, and on the other hand, Russia had seized Crimea already by this point, and had troops massed on the border, and so there was something going on in eastern Ukraine that looked like either it was going to be an invasion or a kind of guerrilla war that was going to be encouraged by the Russians. So there was just this feeling of incredible anger, incredible despair. Here we have done this wonderful thing. We paid for it with our blood, and now this country that really we've been trying to get away from now for 25 years, some would say for hundreds of years, is once again going to ruin everything. Then in the summer I went back, and I went to the east, and to Donetsk, which was the largest city in the areas that had fallen under rebel control. And not only was it the largest city that had fallen under rebel control, it was, I think, the fourth largest city in Ukraine. It had been the power center of the eastern political forces, the supporters of Yanukovych. So it was a big city. It was in certain ways a rich city. From afar, from America, And from Kiev, it had looked like this place that had basically been seized by, Russian agents, and they had fomented a rebellion. They had made it look like it had popular support when in fact it didn't. And what was surprising to me was the level of support for the rebels in Donetsk. I had not expected that. I had expected to see a much more visible Russian presence in Donetsk. It turns out you show up there, there's a lot of people in camouflage with Kalashnikovs and, other guns besides Kalashnikovs. But they don't have Russian flags on them. If you ask them, they won't tell you. There were clearly people who were not soldiers, who had picked up guns, and then there were clearly people who were soldiers, looked like soldiers, who carried themselves like soldiers, who also had guns. So the people who weren't soldiers and picked up guns, those were clearly locals. And then the actual soldiers, I think, were some combination of former Ukrainian soldiers who had gone over to the rebels and Russians who had come there. But in terms of just talking to people, the surprising thing for me was simply the number of people who genuinely felt threatened by Maidan, who, on the one hand, believed Russian propaganda, that the new regime in Kiev was a fascist regime that was going to come to Donetsk, take away Lenin, and make everyone start speaking Ukrainian. On the other hand, it was people who had experienced two things. They had experienced, first of all, the previous pro-Ukrainian regime, which had come to power after the Orange Revolution. And that regime was not a fascist regime. It did not come and knock down Lenin, but it did very much try to write a new narrative of Ukrainian history that was written from the kind of Western Ukrainian point of view. And it was unquestionably anti-Russian. It was a narrative of Ukrainian history that was meant to separate, to put as much distance between Ukraine and Russia as possible. And for people who were living in Eastern Ukraine, who are living there, they actually feel, even though they have Ukrainian passports, or had them until recently, they were simply closer to Russia. They had relatives across the border in Russia, more so than they had relatives in Kiev. As one person that I talked to in Donetsk said, there were more trains per day heading to Moscow from Donetsk than there were to Kiev, right? I mean, so one thing that the people in Donetsk had experienced was this previous regime that really had, culturally at least, and in certain ways politically, marginalized them. That had happened. And it was their belief, and that's why they voted for Yanukovych in 2010. And it was their belief that that was going to happen again, and it was going to be much worse. One of the first things that the post-Maidan parliament did was vote on a law to cancel Russian as a second language. The law was not signed by the acting president, so it did not go into law. But that was the first thing that they did. So, the optics, as we say, from Donetsk, it really did look like something bad might happen. The other thing that these people experienced was 20 plus years of living in Ukraine, seeing the mines close that had been built by the Soviets, seeing an extreme bifurcation of society where some people became very rich, most people became poor. So it was the people who had lost, right? It was the people who had not done well in that 20 plus years. Those were the people who supported the rebels. And that was a lot of people. I mean, there was also kind of self-selecting mechanism where most of the people who had businesses or who were, young professionals, most of those people had left. By the time August came around, they were in Kiev or Kharkiv. They had left Donetsk, right? So it was a kind of, I would say that probably, between support for the rebels and support for the Maidan in Donetsk, maybe it was 50-50, maybe it was 60 for the rebels, 40 for Maidan. By the time I got there, it was probably 90-10, just because so many people had left. So in a way, it was like being in opposite world, right? Where, everything that you thought was this way, when you were sitting in Kiev or in New York, when you're in Donetsk, it's upside down. And, all the things that you thought were courageous, when I watched YouTube videos, and one of the things that's kind of everybody talks about, but until you see it, it's a little hard to understand. It's everybody has YouTube, right? So I'm sitting in Brooklyn and watching YouTube videos of Maidan, right? People in Donetsk are also sitting in Donetsk and watching these YouTube videos. But we have very different, but people in Kiev are participating, but maybe also they're sitting at home and watching the videos. And when I saw, and I think when people who were sort of sympathetic to Maidan saw young kids, confronting the riot police, that was inspiring. It was courageous, right? You see police, and then you see young people. You're kind of automatically on the side of the young people, and they're fighting back. That's great. Maybe that's how you bring about political change. From Donetsk, it looked very different. Because some of these people were actually members of right-wing organizations, right? They were ultra nationalists. As far as I can tell, overall there weren't that many of these right-wing kids in the total, of the hundreds of thousands who sometimes came. Maybe you had 1,000 people who were ultra right-wing, but at certain moments, when there weren't hundreds of thousands of people out there, when there were 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 people, and a lot of the people who did the real fighting against the riot police were the right sector. It was the militant wing of Svoboda, which is the right-wing party. So yes, there were very active right-wing groups on Maidan. And for people in Donetsk looking at those YouTube videos, that was a very different impression that they received. They basically saw fascists, or fascist without quotes. They saw fascists out on the streets fighting, the police who were trying to keep order. Yeah, I mean, so you have this group of people who they were never happy. They were raised in the Soviet Union, right? At some point I did the math, and just by if you just do the math of Soviet Union ended in 1991, that was 24 years ago. Most people in Ukraine were born before 1991, right? 2/3, say, So and most of those people, came to consciousness, right, under the Soviet Union. So they were taught a particular set of ideas. Some of those ideas were lies, but some of them were, weren't so bad, right? They were social equality and the dignity of work, social welfare, right? Free education, free medicine. These were not ideals that were always achieved, but they weren't bad ideals, right? Then suddenly, in 1991, a little earlier, everything's upside down, right? Everything that you've been told is a lie, not just that the Soviet Union was great and that the West was evil. Not just that stuff, not just that Lenin was great, but all this stuff was great. And in fact, free medicine is also horrible, and that's what's holding us back. Subsidizing home energy heating is bad, right? Free housing is bad. So for some people, this was liberating. It was great, right? Especially for younger people. People who were educated, right? People who had opportunities. This was fantastic. For other people, certainly older people, right, who saw their savings evaporate, who really, you get on a bus in any post-Soviet city, it is shocking. The only people on that bus are, people over 70. Right? Young people do not take public transportation, right? Old people, you see these old people just kind of climbing up onto the bus, right? And it's not like becoming a retiree in the United States and you move to Florida, and at a certain point, you crash your, Cadillac and they take away your license, because you can't drive anymore. That's not what it's like to be a retiree in Eastern Ukraine, right? So certainly for old people, it was a catastrophe. Some people, old people in my family, they said, they lost their life savings, but it was okay because they believed in it, right? So they were like, well, that's, we have to transition, and if my life savings go up in smoke, that's part of the transition, right? So there certainly were people who were believers in this, and even though they suffered economically, that was okay. My family in Moscow, that pretty much describes it. But some people weren't, did not suddenly become believers, right? Especially people who were connected to the industrial economy of Eastern Ukraine. Right, the mines, the metallurgy, a lot of those things are still active, and the big oligarch Akhmetov, who is in trouble now, but who had been the richest man in Ukraine, he made his money by basically privatizing all that industry, and a lot of his business, was actually European oriented. It wasn't just toward Russia. But of course, in the process of making these things more efficient, making them more competitive, a lot of people lost their jobs, and those jobs just weren't so great anymore. A miner in Soviet times, that was a really good job. It was a dangerous job, and you did it for 25 years, and then you got lung cancer, but you got paid well. Right? Now it continues to be that kind of job. It's no longer particularly well paid. So for those people, yeah. So those people were told everything that in 1991 they were told everything that you've been told until now is a lie. Now we were going to tell you something else. It's the truth. And some people believed this and they went along and succeeded, and some people believed it and went along and failed. A lot of people failed, right? And so I think the rebellion in the East, for these people, it gave them an opportunity to say, well, actually, let's go back to the way things were. We were happier then. It was better then. So it was a kind of a purely sort of, I guess, reactionary, if you want, but also it was very kind of understandable and very human, and it wasn't just a function of Russian propaganda. It wasn't. So something that I noticed a few years ago in both a place in Ukraine and in Kazakhstan, which is an very interesting case, was just how difficult, in a way, it is to move out of the Russian sphere, both politically but also culturally. So in Kazakhstan, you have a northern Kazakhstan, which is predominantly Russian. At independence, Kazakhstan had something like I want to say 12 million people, and of those 12 million, the plurality were either Russian or Ukrainian, ethnically, and then Kazakhs. So there were more Slavs in Kazakhstan than there were Kazakhs. And that has been actually used as an argument by Russian nationalists. They say, actually, Russia ethnically defined is a bit bigger than the Russia that is currently defined as Russia, because a lot of Russian ethnics, Russian language speakers, there's a lot of Russian language speakers everywhere, but Russian ethnics in northern Kazakhstan, eastern Ukraine, and in the eastern portion of the Baltics. So there is this, there's been this long-standing, since 1991, argument. One of the people who actually articulated it was Solzhenitsyn, saying, well, actually Russia should have been bigger. And that has been something that's made, whenever somebody says that, people get nervous. So Kazakhstan actually moved their capital from southern Kazakhstan to kind of north-central Kazakhstan. They moved and they built a whole brand new city called Astana, kind of in the middle of the steppe, partly to project power into northern Kazakhstan. But it's a situation where a lot of the Russians and Ukrainians who were in northern Kazakhstan have left, and the ones who remain are pretty disaffected. They're not having a great time in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has done very well with oil and gas. They inherited one of the largest, basically Russia, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan are the kind of oil and gas rich post-Soviet countries. Ukraine, not at all. So Kazakhstan has on the one hand become a quite wealthy, certainly by Central Asian standards, country. They've done a pretty good job of keeping that money inside the country, but they're always conscious of Russia to the north. I mean, they've been very nervous throughout the Ukrainian crisis, and Russia has made some noises again about northern Kazakhstan, which is something that makes the Kazakhs very nervous. So you have this kind of attempt by these countries. So what do you do if you have this very large Russian minority? How do you integrate them? I would say, I don't know of a post-Soviet republic that's done a very good job with that. In the Baltics, Russian ethnics have been pretty uniformly denied of rights, political rights. And there's two sides to this, because you're in Estonia. A lot of the Russians came over during the Soviet era, so they were colonizers, and they don't want to learn Estonian. Estonian's hard. So, what do you do? Do you put in a language requirement for citizenship? And Estonia has done that. They have a language requirement. In Ukraine, the situation is particularly fraught and complicated, because actually, Estonian is very different from Russian, whereas Ukrainian is actually quite close to Russian, right? They're both Slavic languages. They're not mutually comprehensible. They're not that close, but it's not that hard for a Russian speaker to learn Ukrainian. And yet, a lot of the Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine don't want to. They refuse. And meanwhile, Ukrainian TV mostly is in Ukrainian, right? And this is incredibly problematic, because Russian TV is full of lies. So and so people in Eastern Ukraine are Russian speakers. For whatever reason, they don't want to learn Ukrainian, and you were broadcasting from Kiev to them in Ukrainian, right? And then then you're complaining that the Russians are sending all this propaganda, and all these people do is watch Russian propaganda. And there was a lot last year. There were attempts to, mostly successful attempts to turn off Russian channels in Ukraine, right? So you can't get Russian channels anymore in Kiev. But of course, in rebel territory, the cable companies say, well, why should we do that? People want these Russian channels, so in those territories you can, and so there's this tug of war. But it seemed like actually it'd be simpler to just have some more Russian language programming to present the point of view from Kiev, if those are the people you're kind of interested in winning over. One thing that I have sort of kind of wrestled a lot with in the past. Since I've started writing about Russia years ago, but really in the past year and a half, it's become something I think about constantly, is just the question of the various informational spheres in which one is existing, right? So I feel like it's very easy to think of yourself as kind of floating in between various media spheres. So, I read Russian, right? So, and I read a lot of Russian media, not the official media. I read the kind of opposition media, but, because it has more information and better written. Past year and a half, I've been reading a ton of Ukrainian media, a lot of which is in Russian, or is available in Russian. But also Google Translate, which is kind of a disaster with most languages. From Ukrainian to Russian, it works fantastically because the kind of sentence structure is the same. It's just a matter of I consume a lot of Ukrainian media, and of course American and British media. So it's easy to feel like I actually am nowhere. I'm in all these places, but ultimately, when I'm writing for the Anglo-American media, right, I'm mostly being read by people who are in those places, in New York or London. And certainly from over here, I feel like there's been an incredible resurgence of Cold War tropes. Putin is basically Saddam Hussein at this point, right? If you want to scare the kids at night, right, you tell them about Putin. And not to say that Putin is blameless, or a good guy. I really think it's gotten out of hand, So I did feel, in writing this article, like I wanted to push back a certain amount, and I was writing it for, an Anglo-American audience, to the point where some of my Russian and Ukrainian friends, but particularly my Russian friends, said, you minimize the role of Russia in this situation, right? There's not enough in here about how Russia has fomented this whole rebellion. And I think from their perspective, that's true, right? Because they're sitting in Russia, and that's what they are thinking about. That's what they should be thinking about, right? They should be thinking, what is my government doing in Ukraine, right? What are its crimes? I think for us in the West, we should be aware of what Russia is doing, but also I think our first priority should be thinking, what are we doing? What are our governments doing? When I was in Donetsk and there were negotiations going on for a ceasefire, my sources, for what they're worth, but I was told that in those negotiations, it was the Ukrainian side that was being intransigent. The Ukrainian side, which was, with the strong support of the U.S. in August, because at that point the Ukrainians thought they could win. Right? They were advancing on Donetsk. It looked like they were going to win. A week after I left Donetsk, the rebels started a counteroffensive, which clearly with the help of the Russians, that was devastating and devastated the Ukrainian army in the east. But for me, writing in the London Review of Books, I thought it was very important to give a narrative that was different from the one that we were hearing. A narrative that was true, but maximally in opposition to what we were being fed for the past year.